In my presentation, I'm actually going to focus specifically on women affected by crises rather than women in terms of strategy and staffing, as Sarah also touched upon. So first of all, I'll provide a little introduction to cash transfer programming for those of you who aren't fully aware of what it entails. And then I'll talk about the interaction between cash transfer programming and gender, and more specifically women, from two lenses really. One which is sort of a do no harm lens, so how can we reduce protection risks for women when we're doing cash transfer programming, and the other is, I suppose, a do more good lens, so what's the evidence on how cash transfer programming can really increase outcomes for women, and how, and what are the implications for programming. So a little bit about my background. So I've been in the humanitarian sector for about 10 years. And I started working on food security and livelihoods, and a lot of that is about how we work through markets to deliver assistance to people in need. And so that led me to specialize, if you like, in market-based programming and specifically in the use of cash transfers. And so I've had a number of different roles with donors and NGOs, headquarters, field level, etc. And now I work for the Cash Learning Partnership, which is also known as CALP. And we're the global partnership for cash transfer programming and humanitarian aid. So we're a member network of about 50 members, including private sector partners, so your MasterCard, Visa, for example, those who are really facilitating cash at scale, as well as our traditional humanitarian actors, I guess. So what we do is we work collectively to increase the scale and quality of cash transfer programming through capacity building, research, coordination, and so on. So what is cash transfer programming? Some of you may have heard a lot about it, certainly there's a lot of momentum around it at the moment. So it's the use of cash and vouchers directly, cash and or vouchers, directly to beneficiaries in order to meet their immediate needs or kind of recovery needs after a shock. And so it really is just a tool, so it can be used for all sorts of objectives and in all sorts of different contexts, humanitarian contexts, longer term social protection. It can be used to support WASH of access to services, for example, but not availability of services necessarily. So there's lots of opportunities, but it's not a fix-all either. What is really promising, though, is that the evidence to support the use of cash transfer programming is getting stronger and stronger, both from a beneficiary perspective, in terms of it being their preferred choice in a whole range of different contexts. There's a study that's on our website. It's not as exciting as blood, but it's on voices and views of beneficiaries on unconditional cash transfers. And that's just a little snapshot of some of the positive evidence from the beneficiary perspective. But also at community level, I mean, it can be a much more sustainable form of assistance in terms of you're supporting local economies and market recovery. And then from a more operational kind of bottom line sort of level as well, the efficiency gains are quite significant, especially when cash is being delivered at scale. So that's part of the big push behind cash at the moment, which is heavily driven by donors in a way as a result of that. And I think it's important to talk about that kind of political momentum because it provides a lot of opportunities in terms of, okay, well, how do we seize that and how do we make sure that we're doing this type of programming right for different groups, including women. And so there's another little study that I would recommend, big study in fact, called Doing Cash Differently, which is by ODI, and it's a high-level panel on cash transfers, and it gives you a bit of background into all the momentum behind it. So I think one thing that's sort of particularly interesting about cash is not so much, well, I expect I've just touched on some of the benefits at beneficiary level and community level, but it's also the sort of transformative potential that it has, because what you're doing is you're putting power more into the hands of the people who are affected by crises. So you're shifting the power dynamic that currently exists in humanitarian assistance. And that's challenging because it challenges the ways that we're set up as a humanitarian sector, working in on particular sectoral specialities, but actually when you're talking about household and communities' needs, that's not how they think about it. So So when we're thinking about that transformative potential, I think we can think about that really in a positive sense and think, okay, well, what about the transformative effect then on women and how to maximize that? Okay, so that was a little bit of background. Now thinking about how can we ensure that when we are using cash transfers, so by that I mean cash and or vouchers, for different objectives, how can we reduce the potential risks that there might be for women, this type of programming? So there certainly are risks, just as with any other type of programming, and Sarah's just touched on quite a few. So one that we see commonly is that cash for work gets used as a response. So what that means is actually paying people to do some manual labor, which also has a community benefit. But this often happens actually in the aftermath of natural disasters. And if you involve women in that kind of work, often it's not sort of gender adapted. And so as a result, not only does it place a big physical burden on them, but also it results in childcare issues, additional nutritional issues, and so on. And I mean, I witnessed this myself firsthand after the Haiti earthquake, when actually, whilst there was progress and more momentum behind cash programming, it wasn't really at the level that it is now. So there were huge cash for work programs immediately after an extremely dramatic shock. And that was, I mean, for women to be involved in that kind of work when they had so many other pressing priorities, it was just not appropriate. So that's shifting. That's an example. Another consideration might be, okay, if you're providing cash to women through, you want to do it through digital means, for example, or through, financial service, through financial services that might not be tailored to their particular needs. So if you're, for example, if it's in a country where women can't have access to banking services or where there's a high rate of illiteracy, that's also potentially a risk in terms of exclusion. Another one might be polygamous households. So if you're going to be, it depends how you're counting the household, but it might be a risk of women within that household being excluded from that kind of assistance. So a lot of these are not necessarily cash specific, but still certainly worth considering. Interestingly, I think there's been a lot of studies on the risk of physical and emotional abuse towards women who are recipients, or within a household that's receiving cash transfers. And actually, the evidence is, it's mixed, it's nuanced, I would say, but in general, it's relatively limited in terms of the evidence of additional physical and emotional abuse resulting from cash transfers. And actually, the longer term evidence is that it reduces household conflict. So how do we mitigate against these risks? I mean, as with most good programming, it really depends on a thorough understanding of what the situation is and gender analysis. But there are also some, as I mentioned with the delivery mechanism, how they're actually getting the cash, there are some real concrete things that you can do. So really interesting example that I like is Concern, the NGO Concern in Niger. They were providing cash transfers for nutritional purposes to women there. And they did a comparison between providing cash directly in an envelope for the whole month and then providing it through mobile cash transfers on a weekly basis, but with smaller amounts. And the nutritional impacts on children in this case, but were much higher through providing it on a kind of punctual basis like that, both because the women were receiving it in a more discreet way, so they had more control over how it was spent, but also because it was staggered, they could buy more fresh food on a more regular basis. It's just an example. So I'm going to go into a couple of examples of how cash can do more good and really empower women. But before that, I think just wanted to sort of debunk a kind of myth that there is, which is that if you provide cash to the woman in the household, that will necessarily be better in terms of the impacts on that for that woman and on the household as a whole. And actually, the evidence is pretty mixed around that because often, if you do that, that might be as an automatic response that might disrupt existing household dynamics and could lead to more violence within the household. So it's not a given. Okay, so in terms of the positive impact of cash on women and how it can be used really as a tool to improve women's well-being, there's there's significant evidence now, and some of the cases I'm referring to are from systematic reviews conducted by ODI and the World Food Programme and UNHCR. So cash transfers have been demonstrated to have a positive effect on well-being and opportunities, particularly in terms of education and employment, and that's especially with longer-term programs. Also on programs that are specifically about reducing gender-based violence, there's positive evidence of cash having that effect, especially if it's combined with protection services. There's an interesting example of a study done by IRC in Jordan on that. Then in terms of empowerment, so certainly, again, these systematic studies have demonstrated that cash can have a positive effect in terms of empowering women in their marriage and fertility choices, so increased decision-making over those big decisions. And then also in terms of economic empowerment as well, so decision-making over livelihoods and investment in productive assets and so on. And that's what's particularly interesting there is that that chance of economic, the potential to empower women economically really depends on how that money is transferred and whether it's done in a way that is thinking about long-term financial inclusion. So if you just give them an envelope during a 6-month period, you're not thinking about what's the longer-term potential to, to provide them with access to financial services and how might that lead to improved development outcomes over time. And there's some really interesting evidence done on that by Give Directly and also the M-Pesa program, which was one of the kind of pioneering mobile phone transfer programs in Kenya that some of you might have heard of. Yes, okay, sorry. Okay, so just to conclude then, as you can see, cash transfers are really, can be a really effective policy instrument to enhance the well-being of women and girls. And there's huge potential to maximize them, but cash is just a tool. So as I said, with any good programming, it really requires that understanding of context and that gender analysis. So let's really capitalize together on the momentum behind women's empowerment and cash, but do it right.